Good evening, traveler. Wherever you are, however you've found your way here, I invite you to rest. You've made it through another day, and now it's time to let your thoughts drift elsewhere. Tonight, we'll step quietly through the swinging doors of history, settle into a wooden chair, and ask a question that might not have crossed your mind before. What exactly did folks eat and drink in the saloons of the Wild West? Let's take a look. When we think about saloons, the first things that usually come to mind are clinking glasses, dusty boots, and perhaps a fight or two breaking out near the bar. But saloons were far more than drinking holes. In many towns across the American frontier, they served as the beating heart of the community. They were gathering spots, post offices, gambling dens, and, for many, the only place to get a hot meal that wasn't cooked over a personal campfire. Saloons varied greatly depending on where they were. In mining towns carved into the edges of mountains, you might find a rough-hewn shack offering only hardtack and weak coffee. In larger cities like Dodge or Deadwood, saloons could be grand, with chandeliers made of antlers and menus filled with surprising variety. The owners of these establishments were often savvy entrepreneurs, quick to realize that serving food brought in a different kind of clientele. People with slower wallets but steadier habits. The earliest saloons, sprouting up in the 1820s and 30s along the trails that cut through the West, offered only the basics. Meals were often an afterthought, if offered at all, but as settlements grew, so did expectations. By the 1870s and 80s, saloons had begun serving meals regularly, either as part of a boarding service or simply to keep the patrons in their seats longer. So, what ended up on the plates of these patrons? Well, it depended on what could be caught, shot, traded, or hauled in by wagon. Refrigeration, of course, was non-existent, and even ice had to be brought in from great distances, often at high cost. That meant that meat was either dried, salted, smoked, or consumed quickly. Fish was rare unless you were near a river or coast, and vegetables, if they existed at all, were likely to be canned or root-based, potatoes, onions, or carrots. A typical meal might start with beans, plain, pinto, or navy, slow, cooked over a fire and flavored with bacon or salt pork if you were lucky. These weren't the sweet baked beans we think of today, but more a dense, filling paste designed to keep a body moving through long hours of work. Bread was another staple, usually in the form of biscuits or cornbread. Flour traveled better than fresh food, and a good cook could turn even old supplies into something warm and edible. Meat, when available, was usually fried or stewed. Game like rabbit, squirrel, or venison was common, especially in wooded areas, while beef or pork came from local farms or traveling traders. Chicken was prized not just for its flavor, but because hens also laid eggs, a dual-purpose animal that was worth keeping alive until absolutely necessary. There was little in the way of seasoning beyond salt, pepper, and the occasional spice brought in from far-off markets. Chili powder and cayenne began appearing more frequently in Texas and the Southwest, likely influenced by Mexican cuisine. These ingredients made otherwise bland meals more palatable and more memorable. If a saloon had the means, it might offer a stew made from whatever was on hand. Sometimes thick with potatoes and bits of meat, sometimes more broth than substance. Served in tin bowls and eaten with wooden spoons, it wasn't elegant, but it was nourishing. Most meals were eaten quickly, standing up or seated on stools near the bar. Plates were rarely ceramic, more often metal or wooden, something that could survive a drop or a brawl. And coffee, always coffee, strong and black, boiled until bitter. It was served in thick mugs and refilled often. Sugar was a luxury, and milk was near impossible unless you were near a ranch. As for those with a sweet tooth, well, dessert wasn't common, but if you happened to be near a town with a bakery, or a saloon run by someone with access to molasses or dried fruits, you might be lucky enough to find a slab of pie or bread pudding. Not fresh, perhaps, but enough to remind someone of a distant home. There's something deeply human in imagining these meals. We know these places mostly through film and legend. The shootouts, the sheriffs, the outlaws. But between all that noise were men and women simply trying to get by and trying to eat. A bowl of stew, a heel of bread, a cup of coffee. Sustenance served on wooden counters under flickering lanterns. And so, as the rain taps gently on your windows tonight or the wind curls against the glass, imagine yourself there. In the corner of a warm saloon, the smell of beans and bacon in the air. Your cup full and your boots dry for once. The night stretches long, but you've got a place to sit, a meal to eat, and a story to keep you company. When the sun rose over the plains or crested the ridges of mountain towns, it wasn't roosters that called the people of the West to their feet. It was the rhythm of necessity. Life in the frontier demanded movement, and movement demanded fuel. Breakfast wasn't a luxury in those days. It was a requirement, and for many, the first stop after waking wasn't the campfire, but the saloon. You might not expect a place with swinging doors and poker tables to offer a hearty morning meal, but for cowboys and travelers, a saloon breakfast could mean the difference between a successful day and one riddled with fatigue. Saloons in larger towns often opened early, not just for those already drinking, but to serve those passing through, heading to work, or returning from long shifts guarding cattle or cutting timber. The staple of any saloon breakfast was bread, and not the kind we think of today. We're talking about heavy hand-formed biscuits, cooked in cast-iron pans over open flames. These biscuits were dense, crusted on the outside, and soft inside if the cook had done things right. They weren't sweet, but they were reliable, capable of soaking up grease or gravy, and easily wrapped in cloth to be carried later in the day. Accompanying those biscuits, almost without fail, were beans, usually pinto or navy. These beans had soaked overnight and were cooked slowly, sometimes with leftover pork fat or a single bone for flavor. Often they'd be stewed with onions or garlic if they were available. This was food made for endurance, not delight. Filling, warm, and ready before the frost had even lifted from the dirt roads outside. Salt pork was another common fixture. Unlike bacon, which was more expensive and difficult to store long-term without refrigeration, salt pork was heavily cured, tougher, and far saltier. But once cooked, usually pan-fried until its edges turned brown and crispy, it brought fat and salt to the plate in equal measure. If you had it alongside eggs, it was a good day. If not, a few pieces mixed into beans or layered on biscuits still gave the meal substance. And then there were the eggs. Chickens were harder to keep in wild regions, but saloons that sourced from nearby farms or that doubled as boarding houses often had a steady supply. The eggs were rarely scrambled or poached. They were fried hard on iron pans, often in bacon grease or lard. The texture was rubbery, but the taste was unmistakably grounding. In colder months, eggs were in short supply, and when they were available, they were served quickly to avoid spoiling. Coffee was the cornerstone. It wasn't the smooth, nuanced drink of baristas and bean connoisseurs. It was rough, boiled black, and brewed in enormous kettles that sat on stoves all day. Grounds sometimes floated in the mugs, and sugar, if it existed at all, came at a premium. Milk was virtually non-existent unless a saloon owner had ties to a nearby dairy, which was rare. But the coffee did its job. It woke up men after long nights, steadied hands before dangerous work, and gave warmth to bodies chilled by cold air and colder prospects. In southern or southwestern regions, where Mexican and Spanish influences were stronger, morning meals looked a little different. You might find tortillas instead of biscuits, beans cooked with peppers, or even early versions of what we now call breakfast burritos. Eggs and meat wrapped in warm flatbread, easy to eat while walking or riding. Other regions saw variations as well. In the Pacific Northwest, where lumber towns were growing fast, you might get smoked salmon or trout if you were lucky. In colder northern settlements, smoked meats or dried venison often appeared in place of pork. In prairie towns, you could sometimes find grits or cornmeal mush. Simple, but hot and plentiful. And always the food was determined by what could be transported. Remember, this was a world without trucks or refrigerated rail cars. Supply chains were men on horseback or wagon, hauling sacks of flour, beans, coffee, and lard across long distances. Prices fluctuated wildly depending on location, season, and conflict. A drought might double the price of potatoes. A flood could ruin shipments. A war, skirmish, or railroad strike could stop everything for weeks. That made cooks creative. They reused grease. They boiled bones into broth. They saved every crust of bread, every leftover spoon of beans, every slice of dried meat. Nothing went to waste. Even coffee grounds were sometimes boiled a second or third time. Some saloons even had rotating morning specials, though they weren't advertised as such. It simply meant that the cook was using up whatever was on hand. One day it might be biscuits and beans. The next, boiled oats with a hint of cinnamon if someone had traded for a spice pouch the week before. It was inconsistent, unpredictable, but deeply rooted in survival. Breakfast wasn't quiet either. The clink of tin plates, the scrape of boots, the sound of spurs on wooden floors. Men talked in low voices, reading newspapers if they could find one, or going over cattle tallies, card debts, or rumors of work. The morning meal in a saloon was where plans were made, routes were confirmed, and tensions sometimes settled before they had the chance to explode later in the day. Sometimes saloon breakfasts were served alongside shots of whiskey, a morning ritual for those shaking off a cold night, a hangover, or a loss at the tables. It was not uncommon to see men down a plate of pork and beans with one hand and a whiskey glass with the other. Coffee came after, or sometimes not at all. Women, if they were present in these saloons, were often workers themselves, cooks, servers, entertainers, or owners. Their meals were often eaten in the kitchen or in quiet corners, away from the louder, dustier front rooms. They, too, needed food that would carry them through long hours, and the same biscuits, beans, eggs, and salt pork were served with little variation, save perhaps for portion size. In rare, wealthier towns, breakfast menus were printed or chalked onto wooden boards. These saloons might offer ham, sausage, potatoes fried with onions, or even fresh fruit brought in by rail. Apples, oranges, berries. But these meals came at a cost, often several times the price of a standard plate. For the everyday traveler, such luxuries were a glimpse into another world. And so the day began. Plates emptied, cups drained, and with bellies full, or at least no longer empty, men and women stepped back into the dust, into the heat or cold, into work and travel and risk and survival. But for a brief moment, over a tin plate and a warm biscuit, there was peace. As the day wore on and the sun climbed high over the dusty streets and wide plains, stomachs began to growl again, and thoughts turned once more to food. Lunch in the Wild West wasn't about leisure. It was about keeping going. The midday meal, more often called dinner in the vernacular of the time, was meant to be practical, filling, and fast. Whether you were a ranch hand, a trapper, a drifter, or a blacksmith, you needed a meal that wouldn't slow you down but would carry you through the afternoon's labor. Saloon lunches, like everything in the frontier, were shaped by what was available. In many towns, especially those without formal restaurants or boarding houses, the saloon was the only public place to eat. But even the best saloons didn't have a full kitchen. Often just a wood stove, a couple of iron pans, and a cook who knew how to stretch limited supplies into something edible. At noon, the pace inside changed. The gamblers might still linger, but new faces came in. Men from the rail yards, messengers on horseback, young boys delivering telegrams, weary travelers brushing trail dust from their shoulders. They'd slap coins on the bar and ask what was hot, and more often than not, what was hot was stew. Thick, brown, bubbling. Stew was the go-to meal for midday crowds. It could be made in large batches, cooked slowly over a fire, and filled with whatever odds and ends were on hand. Bits of meat, sometimes beef, sometimes pork, sometimes rabbit or even jackrabbit, floated alongside potatoes, carrots, onions, and beans. If meat was scarce, flour was added to thicken the broth, giving it the illusion of richness even when the ingredients were humble. Seasoning was light. Salt, if you had it, maybe pepper or a pinch of chili powder. In southwestern towns, chopped green chilies or cumin might make their way into the pot. In northern areas, the flavor leaned toward black pepper and garlic. The stew was usually ladled into deep metal bowls and served with a hunk of bread or cornbread. Not delicate slices, but thick, crusty pieces that could soak up broth or be used as spoons if utensils were in short supply. There was no garnish, no flair, just sustenance, served steaming hot and meant to be eaten quickly. For cowboys out on cattle drives, lunch looked different. There was no saloon on the open range, just a chuck wagon and a cook known as the cookie. These men were the heart of the trail crew. They rose before dawn, built fires, and prepared meals from dried beans, salted meat, sourdough biscuits, and whatever could be caught or foraged. Cowboys would eat standing up or squatting in the shade of the wagon, hats tipped low against the sun, plates in hand. Lunch was quick, 15, maybe 20 minutes. Then it was back to the saddle. Beans, biscuits, and coffee. Sometimes jerky, thick and chewy, made from beef dried with salt and smoke. Other times, it was son-of-a-gun stew, made from cow organs and offcuts, cooked slowly into something resembling nourishment. In mining towns, lunch might be served right at the mouth of the mine or in nearby tents where cooks made do with canned goods, condensed milk, pickled vegetables, or tins of mutton or sardines. A tin of peaches was a rare treat, and sometimes men would trade tools or gold dust just for a slice of canned fruit. Saloon owners knew their customers were on the move. Meals were often served on the run, wrapped in cloth or paper, handed through side doors to riders who didn't even dismount. Cornbread wrapped around slices of fried meat. Hard rolls filled with cold beans or mashed potatoes. Food wasn't always hot, but it was filling. And if a saloon was doing well, they might offer cold cuts or cheese. Cheese traveled better than milk and was easier to store. A few thin slices of cheddar with pickled onions or a wedge of bread could pass as a proper meal for a man in a hurry. The drinks, even at lunch, still flowed. Beer was more common than whiskey during the noon hour, especially in German or Irish towns where brewing was taken seriously. A cold pint with stew or bread was more than a drink. It was hydration in a world where clean water wasn't always guaranteed. And always there was coffee, simmering in blackened pots, left to grow stronger with each passing hour. Some men called it six-shooter coffee, strong enough to wake the dead, bitter enough to keep you focused until sunset. Women who passed through saloons at this time were usually serving, clearing tables, washing tin plates, or helping in the kitchens. A few towns had respectable lunchrooms where ladies could dine separately, but in most cases, if you wanted to eat, you ate wherever food was being served. Respectability took a back seat to hunger. Lunch could also be the moment of calm before a storm. Many disputes began with shared meals. Disagreements over land, cards, or cattle often broke out at the table, leading to shouting matches or worse. Saloon keepers kept a close eye on the room during the lunch hour. If a man was drunk before noon, he might be asked to leave. If he refused, things could escalate quickly. In nicer saloons, the kind with polished wood bars and lace curtains in the windows, lunch might come with a paper menu and a waiter. Fried oysters shipped in by rail. Pot roast with potatoes. Maybe even a glass of wine if you asked politely. But such places were rare. Urban oases in a desert of dust and grit. And for those on the fringes, Native Americans, Chinese laborers, African American workers, saloon access varied wildly. Some establishments welcomed them, others barred them entirely. Where they were excluded, separate cafes or cookhouses formed, places where different culinary traditions thrived. Noodles with pork and vegetables, steamed buns, flatbreads cooked over coals. The West, for all its roughness, was a place of mingled tastes. As the sun began to lean westward and the lunch crowds dispersed, the saloon quieted. Plates clattered into basins. The stew pot was scraped clean. The bartender poured another round for the gamblers. The cook cleaned his knives, and once again the town began to hum. Work resumed, horses kicked up dust, and the stories of the day's second half began to write themselves. As the sun slipped below the horizon and the glow of lanterns replaced the long golden light of afternoon, the saloon came alive in a different way. Evening in the frontier wasn't just an end to work. It was a beginning of something else entirely. This was the time when music spilled out of swinging doors, when boots tapped against floorboards, when stories were traded over glasses and plates. And with that came dinner, the final and often most elaborate meal of the day. Unlike the hurried meals of the morning or the practical stews of noon, dinner was where a saloon might truly try to impress. For travelers who had just ridden into town, dinner was the first welcome. For locals, it was the day's reward. And for saloon owners, it was a chance to turn a profit not just through drinks, but by filling bellies and drawing in crowds with the promise of something hot and filling, or even just different from the usual. In the better-funded establishments, the dinner bell signaled more than just food. It hinted at comfort, however modest. The scent of frying meat wafted into the street. Plates clinked, and voices rose in anticipation. And though choices were always limited by supply and the perils of preservation, cooks did what they could to transform ingredients into something hearty. Fried meats were the centerpiece of many evening meals. Chicken, especially, was prized, not only because it tasted good, but because a single bird could be stretched to serve several men if prepared properly. Fried in lard or bacon fat, with a dusting of cornmeal or flour, it was crispy on the outside and tender inside, assuming it hadn't spent too long wandering the yard before being plucked and butchered that morning. Pork chops, when available, were another favorite. Sometimes salted, sometimes fresh. They were typically pan-fried with onions or apples if such luxuries were around. In cattle country, beef was more common. Flank steaks, ribs, or whatever cuts the butcher hadn't already sold to boarding houses and inns. These were cooked quickly, seasoned simply, and served while still sizzling. Sourdough bread was a regular companion to these meats. The West was known for its sourdough, not out of fashion, but necessity. The yeast was wild, cultivated over time in pots and crocks passed from cook to cook. It needed no purchased ingredients to rise, just patience and practice. And when baked right, it was thick-crusted, slightly tangy, and satisfying in a way that hardtack or flatbread could never be. Potatoes were the universal side, fried, mashed, or boiled. They stored well, traveled well, and filled the plate. In some towns, particularly those with Irish immigrants or northern settlers, potato dishes took on local flair, mixed with onions, lard, or bits of salted meat to create hash or pan-fried cakes. Vegetables were far less common. Fresh produce was a rare luxury, often dependent on rail schedules or seasonal gardens. If any appeared on the plate, they were more likely canned. Green beans, corn, or beets soaked in vinegar. These came from tins or glass jars, preserved with brine or sugar, sometimes purchased from traveling salesmen or imported from faraway cities. Gravy, if the cook had enough drippings left over, was poured generously over everything: meat, bread, potatoes, binding the meal into a single, warm, heavy experience. It wasn't refined, but it was rich, and it lingered in the mouth like smoke in the rafters. In the Southwest, flavors took on a bolder edge. Dinner might include tamales wrapped in corn husks, or stewed meat spiced with cumin, garlic, and peppers. Beans and rice were common additions, often cooked slowly throughout the day. And in border towns, tortillas replaced biscuits, adding a soft chew to the plate where crunch had been expected. In Pacific towns or near rivers, fish sometimes graced the evening table. Trout, catfish, or even oysters, shipped by rail in barrels packed with ice, found their way to saloons that could afford the risk of spoilage. Fried, stewed, or even served cold with vinegar, these were rare delicacies, consumed quickly and remembered long after. There were even instances of venison, elk, or bison being served. Game meat brought in by hunters or traded for liquor. These cuts were leaner, sometimes tougher, but deeply flavored. The aroma of roasted venison mixed with tobacco smoke and whiskey in the air made for a truly frontier atmosphere. And for those who could afford it, dessert wasn't out of the question. A slice of apple pie, made with dried apples rehydrated in syrup, or a simple bread pudding soaked in molasses might appear if the cook was ambitious. Sometimes sugar cookies made with lard and flour, flavored with vanilla or cinnamon. Not every night, but enough to make you hope it would be tonight. Evening meals often took longer to eat. Patrons lingered. They talked. They listened to fiddles or piano players. The pace was slower, the stakes lower than they would be later in the evening when gambling and drink would once again take over the room. And in that brief twilight, with plates half finished and candles flickering, there was a sense of something softer than the West's usual edge. A comfort that, for an hour or so, made the saloon feel more like home than frontier. Soon the tables would clear. The music would grow louder. The poker games would begin. But for now, the last bite of fried chicken, the final sip of coffee, the crust of sourdough dipped in stew. This was the West, too. Just quieter, just warmer. If the food in a Wild West saloon offered warmth and sustenance, the drinks delivered something else entirely. Escape, courage, celebration, or simply a way to pass the long hours between dusk and dawn. Alcohol was not just a fixture in these establishments, it was often the very reason they existed. And yet the range and ritual around drinking were far richer than the dusty image of a cowboy throwing back a shot before a bar brawl. Whiskey was king. But what passed for whiskey in the frontier often bore little resemblance to the aged, amber-hued spirit we know today. Much of it was raw, unfiltered, harsh on the tongue, and brutal on the stomach. It was sometimes referred to as rot gut, a term that wasn't just colorful slang but an honest assessment. Bootleggers and barkeeps frequently cut their liquor with anything they had on hand. Tobacco juice, red pepper, turpentine, even gunpowder or kerosene to add color or kick. Still, men drank it by the glass with little ceremony. A nickel might buy you a pour. No ice, no garnish, no chaser. Just a gulp, a grimace, and a nod. The stronger the burn, the better the barkeep. And despite the danger, it worked. It warmed the bones. It quieted nerves. It made a lonely man feel like he had company. For those who preferred something softer, beer offered a more social alternative. Early on, it was served warm. Not by choice, but because refrigeration was a luxury most saloons couldn't afford. German immigrants, especially in towns like Milwaukee or St. Louis, introduced brewing traditions that slowly improved quality and storage. Eventually, rail cars packed with ice allowed kegs to be shipped across longer distances, and a cold beer became a mark of a more civilized saloon. Beer was often poured from wooden kegs into tin cups or glass mugs, depending on the establishment's wealth. It wasn't heavily carbonated, nor particularly strong, but it was drinkable and cheap, and that made it popular with working men. In towns with competing breweries, saloons became informal battlegrounds of loyalty, flying banners or offering discounts based on which brand they supported. Wine existed, but it was rare, especially outside of California or regions with French or Italian settlers. More often, what was called wine was a mixture of fermented fruit, sugar, and anything that would keep it from spoiling. Sweet, potent, and occasionally nauseating, it was served in small doses, often as a curiosity or afterthought. Then there were the more unusual drinks. Sarsaparilla, a popular non-alcoholic beverage, was made from the root of the smilax plant and flavored with herbs and spices. It had a sharp, almost medicinal taste and was served chilled when possible. It offered a cleaner alternative to spirits and was popular among temperance supporters and younger patrons. Some saloons kept bottles of it behind the bar, both for novelty and for those who came just for the company, not the drink. Coffee, surprisingly, was one of the most consumed beverages in the evening. Brewed black, thick, and bitter, it kept gamblers sharp and cowhands alert as they sat through long nights of storytelling or card games. In fact, a pot of coffee often sat simmering beside the liquor, its deep aroma mingling with tobacco smoke and the sharper edge of whiskey in the air. Tea was less common, but appeared more often in frontier towns with Chinese immigrant communities. These teas, brewed carefully and often without milk or sugar, were delicate and fragrant, a striking contrast to the other offerings of the saloon. Occasionally, saloon owners would offer a cup as a novelty, or to curious travelers who had tasted it elsewhere. Absinthe made its way into certain western cities, particularly San Francisco and New Orleans, carried by French immigrants and served in ornate rituals involving sugar cubes and dripping water. It was expensive, uncommon, and often misunderstood. In smaller towns, it was rumored to cause madness, visions, or worse. But among those who sought the exotic, it held a lure. Mixed drinks existed, though rarely in the way we imagine today. Whiskey punch was simply whiskey watered down with sugar and fruit. Gin slings, or rum toddies, were occasionally offered in cooler months, heated with hot water and stirred with cinnamon if it could be spared. More elaborate cocktails would emerge later, toward the end of the 19th century. But in most saloons, the drink was strong, simple, and swift. The glassware told a story, too. In fancier saloons, thick-bottomed tumblers or etched crystal might be used, imported at great expense. But in most, drinks were served in tin cups, chipped enamel mugs, or even repurposed jars. What mattered was the contents, not the vessel. And then there was the culture around the drink. Saloons were places of ritual. A man might slap a coin down before saying a word. A regular might have his spot at the bar, his drink poured before he even asked. Toasts were rare. Westerners were not, as a rule, overly sentimental. But they existed, offered in low voices after funerals, or in louder ones after a winning hand. Drinking also had its risks. Brawls broke out over spilled drinks or slurred insults. Cheats were thrown through doors, or worse. Guns were kept close, and saloon keepers were often more than just bartenders. They were mediators, lawmen, and, when necessary, enforcers. A good barkeep knew when to cut a man off, when to duck, and when to signal the piano player to stop mid-note. Some saloons tried to moderate their drinking culture by offering food alongside every drink, a tactic that encouraged longer stays and steadier heads. Others embraced the chaos, letting the night spill out into the streets with songs, laughter, and the occasional burst of gunfire. And for all the noise and revelry, drinking in the West had quiet moments too. A man alone at the bar, nursing a shot, thinking of lost land, a letter never sent, a road not taken. A woman wiping a glass behind the counter, listening to the rising hum of the room, watching people come and go, knowing they'd be gone again by morning. In those glasses, full or empty, was more than whiskey. There was memory and forgetting, hope and loss. And in the soft clink of glass on wood, something strangely eternal. For all the staple foods and predictable meals served across the Wild West, there existed another layer of culinary experience, one that was stranger, rarer, and deeply tied to the specific lands and lives of the frontier. These were the forgotten dishes, the regional oddities, the meals shaped not by tradition, but by necessity, ingenuity, and local abundance or scarcity. They tell a quieter story, often lost beneath the louder tales of whiskey and beans, but one just as revealing. Start with the snake. Rattlesnake meat, though alarming in concept, was not uncommon in desert regions. Tough, coiled, and dangerous, these creatures were both predator and prey. But for hungry settlers, a rattlesnake was dinner with a bite. The meat, when properly cleaned and skinned, was white and lean. It was usually fried, sometimes battered in cornmeal, or stewed slowly with chili powder and onions. The bones were fine and plenty, requiring patience to eat, but the taste was often described as a cross between chicken and fish. It wasn't just a novelty, it was survival. Then there were prairie oysters, also known as calf fries or Rocky Mountain oysters. Despite the name, these had nothing to do with the sea. They were, in fact, bull testicles, cleaned, sliced, seasoned, and fried. Ranchers who performed castrations on young bulls often saw no reason to waste usable meat. When cooked correctly, the texture was soft, the flavor mild, and the result surprisingly popular among those willing to get past the idea of it. In certain cattle towns, these were served as bar snacks, earning both groans and praise in equal measure. In native communities and areas influenced by indigenous practices, pine nut stew was common, made with gathered pine nuts, wild greens, and game meat, rabbit or venison if available. This dish was earthy and nourishing. The nuts added richness, while the broth was thickened with ground corn or ash. It wasn't found on saloon menus, but it existed just outside those walls, prepared in tents and homesteads, and shared among families. In the high mountains and colder regions, marmot meat, yes, marmot, occasionally appeared on plates. Trapped, cleaned, and roasted or boiled, it was greasy and gamey, but rich in fat. When snow made hunting difficult and livestock couldn't be spared, frontier dwellers turned to whatever moved. Groundhog, squirrel, even skunk, properly cleaned and soaked, became proteins in desperate seasons. Pickled dishes also had a firm place in the saloon kitchen, especially where refrigeration was scarce. Eggs were boiled and stored in jars of brine and vinegar, turning rubbery and tangy. They sat on back counters, sometimes for weeks, taken by the curious or the very hungry. Pickled pig's feet, too, were common. Jarred with garlic and spices, they were eaten cold, chewy, fatty, and oddly satisfying to those who grew up with them. One particularly bizarre dish, noted in a few records, involved boiled cactus pads, served with beans and peppers. Known in Mexican cuisine as nopales, these were sliced thin and sautéed or boiled until tender. Slightly slimy, with a taste not unlike okra, they were rich in vitamins and water, valuable in dry environments. Some saloons in New Mexico or Arizona offered them as a side, often without naming them, just letting customers discover them by taste. There were also dried crickets and grasshoppers, especially in areas where settlers had learned techniques from indigenous groups. Toasted over flames or crushed and added to stews, they provided protein and crunch. Not widely popular, but not unheard of either, especially among more isolated frontier camps. Offal, the discarded parts of animals, saw frequent use. Liver, kidney, tongue, heart. These were not always considered lesser meats, but were prized by many for their richness. Cow tongue was often boiled and sliced thin for sandwiches. Liver was fried with onions and bacon fat. Kidneys were stewed into thick gravies, sometimes mixed with potatoes or cornbread to extend the portion. Some saloons even experimented with fusion, dishes that emerged from the mix of cultures packed into small, dusty towns. A plate might combine Chinese noodles with Western vegetables, or Mexican tamales with spiced ground beef, adapted to American tastes. Railroad towns, with their diversity of laborers, were hotbeds of culinary improvisation. A cook might have soy sauce one day and dried chilies the next, and simply use both. And then there were the strange comfort foods, items that made sense only in the context of scarcity and long travel. Hardtack softened in hot milk, sweetened with a bit of sugar or molasses, beans mashed with tallow and spread on crackers, dried apples rehydrated in whiskey, then baked into crude cobblers. These weren't fine dishes, but they evoked memory, of places left behind, of families far away, of kitchens that no longer existed. Desserts, when they appeared, often required great care. With fresh fruit hard to come by, sweets leaned heavily on what could be preserved. Molasses cakes, made from blackstrap syrup and thick flour batter. Candied ginger or orange peel, saved from traders and used sparingly. Rice pudding, if rice could be found, flavored with nutmeg or dried cherries. These were rare indulgences, and when served, they transformed the mood of a saloon for the briefest of moments. Food, at its heart, was improvisation, and the strangest meals of the Wild West were rarely about shock value. They were about using what you had, where you were, and trying, always trying, to make something good out of very little. In these forgotten dishes, we find the real flavor of the frontier. Tough, surprising, inventive. Nothing wasted, everything tried once, and always, somewhere behind the counter or fire, a cook, tired, clever, and unsung, making do. As the stars brightened over the quiet towns and the wind whispered across the wide, dark plains, the saloons began to thin. The clatter of plates gave way to softer sounds, chairs being stacked, tables wiped down, lanterns turned low. The day was ending, and so too was the long cycle of meals that fed the frontier. By now the fires had cooled, the stew pots scraped clean, and the last heel of bread shared between two tired strangers who no longer needed to speak. This was the closing hour, not just of the day, but of the rhythm that bound every miner, cowboy, gambler, cook, and barkeep to one another in silent necessity. And with it, the legacy of saloon food faded into the hush of night. What lingered, though, was more than the taste of beans or bacon. It was the ritual, the pattern, the way a man stepped through the swinging doors with dust on his boots and left with a full stomach, the way food gave form to a town that might otherwise feel scattered and harsh, the way a shared meal softened edges, of people, of days, of memory. The foods we've spoken of, from salt pork breakfasts to fried chicken dinners, from the strange crunch of prairie oysters to the comfort of sourdough. They weren't just nourishment. They were anchors, reminders that even in a place ruled by chance and hardship, there could be order, even pleasure, even warmth. Many of those dishes have faded. You won't find pine nut stew on a diner menu or hardtack soaked in molasses at a food stall. But echoes remain. Every plate of chili, every skillet of cornbread, every slice of peach cobbler carries a whisper of those early kitchens. Those saloons that served more than drink, more than cards, more than distraction. They served a kind of continuity. A meal eaten at sunset in a dusty saloon might be the one thing that hadn't changed from one town to the next. It might be the only familiar thing to a man who had nothing else to his name. And when a bite of stew reminded him of home, wherever that was, it didn't matter what was missing. For a few quiet minutes, he had something back. We like to think of the Wild West in terms of action. Shootouts, chases, revolvers flashing in the sun. But beneath all of that, it was a place full of ordinary lives. People who woke up hungry and went to bed full, or at least not empty. People who gathered around stew pots and frying pans as if they were campfires. People who knew that food was never just about eating. It was about being seen, being known, being here. And so tonight, as your eyes begin to grow heavy and your thoughts start to wander, picture that saloon one more time. The lantern light, the low hum of tired voices, the warm smell of flour and fat and smoke, a plate in front of you, a mug at your side, a soft chair beneath your spine. The world outside is wild, but in here there's calm. There's something cooked, something shared, something waiting. And now that the story's been told and the table cleared, there's nothing left to do but rest. Good night, traveler. You've made it through the day. Let the night take you gently.